So good day, everyone. And thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here in person this morning. You've come from many long-distance places to be here with us. And thanks to our panel. They're joining us from places where it is quite late in the evening. And so we're very grateful that they are willing to do this. And of course, to Chris, who's here with us in person, and who I think should be joining me up here. So we thought, as Khalil and the rest of us thought about this, we thought it would be useful to talk to you about this story for two reasons. One is so that you have the opportunity to get to know the human beings, the people, who made up the Atlantic Philanthropies board. These programs and this community that we're celebrating in this convening exist today due to the far-sighted generosity of Chuck Feeney, of course. But this was complemented by the ingenuity, the patience, the commitment, vision, and the incredibly hard work of the Atlantic Philanthropies board members and of their partners in the host institutions, and many of you are representing those institutions. Yesterday, when Manuel was talking, there was this aha moment where he said, it's not the economy, but it's our economy. And I was thinking about that during the evening. And Chris never said the Atlantic board. He said my board. And that was, to me, symbolic of the kind of relationship that I hope all of you executive directors will have with your boards, because that support, that journeying together is really important in making something happen. I think the second reason that we wanted to do this was to spend some time reflecting together on the origins of the programs and of the community, in the hopes that a deeper understanding of where you've come from can inform your common efforts to meet the challenges. Some of those challenges are as a result of of the way in which the programs were developed. And some are, of course, new, and some are the result of the context in which you find yourselves. But as a historian, I think that understanding the past can help think about the future. Now, we made an assumption that you've at least seen the book. And as Khalil said, there are copies in the back if you haven't seen it. But the book is just a very small portion of the story. And I think what we wanted to do was to try and think about the deeper, sort of dig deeper into these stories. What was the board's thinking? What were their personal stories? And reflect on some of their struggles, not just the good times and not just what happened in the end, but what were some of the struggles and obstacles along the way. Because while these programs and this community is, in some sense, a gift from Chuck, these gifts come with some long-term challenges that are the result of the way that they were developed. So before we begin, let me just introduce our panelists. And are we going to have them on the screen? I hope so. OK. Good. Great. Thank you. Hi, Sarah and Peter. Welcome. Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot is a MacArthur Prize-winning ethnographic sociologist, recipient of multiple honorary degrees, and an accomplished author with a lifelong commitment to work for equality and social justice. She was the deputy director, the deputy chair of the board, and she brought to that board her deep understanding of human development, her empathy with the people developing the programs, and her concern for whether and how the fellows themselves were being transformed by the program experience. So those of you in the audience who sat in front of that board will remember the kinds of questions that she asked about what are the fellows getting out of this, and what are they doing with it. Now, AP's board chair, Peter Smitham, has a background in economics, business, and management. He brought experience in organizational development from his more than 30 years in private equity, where he focused on startups, and his commitment to helping the vulnerable and disadvantaged through philanthropy. Peter always asked, was the infrastructure adequate? The host environment conducive? The structures and supports and people in place so that the program could be effective and sustainable? Now, as you know, Chris worked closely with Chuck Feeney in multiple senior leadership positions within the Atlantic companies and then the Philanthropies. As president and CEO of the Philanthropies, he led the final phase of grant making on a tight timeline, aiming to ensure that the foundation achieved the greatest possible impact with its remaining resources and concluded its operations in 2020 as planned. Chris brought a deep appreciation for Chuck's and Atlantic's values and goals of promoting fairness, redressing inequities, and investing in those who had been excluded from opportunities. So we're going to begin with a few questions to the panelists and then turn to you all to add your questions. I'm going to start with Peter and start with the big picture. You all worked incredibly hard. You were a small board, unusually small. Thoughtful, dedicated, probing, you journeyed alongside the programs. What was it that you were committed to making happen? What made you work so hard on this? What was the dream, Peter?
We went through a phase around 2011 that was very, very difficult. The board really divided into two parts, and they had different visions for the future. I think one really captured Chuck's values, and the other tended to capture the values, equally valid, of other members of the board. The board shrunk from 16 or 17 to about 10. And there was a greater degree of involvement. I think small boards capture the intensity of the field that we're in and the dynamics and the ambitions that Chuck had. So all of a sudden, the board was much smaller. We had Tom Mitchell, we had Sarah, we had Billy Hall, we had Chris and me. Very, very well represented with very, very strong academic backgrounds. But what we really had was commitment. What we really had was a level of involvement that I don't think I'd ever seen in the smaller board, the larger board, sorry. The level of engagement was totally different. So all of a sudden, there were edges in the conversations about, what would we do next? What really would make a difference? And there were different views, but most of them were very, very similar, and they overlapped. Sarah, a number of times, used expressions like, we don't want to go out with a whimper, we want to go out with a bang. We want to go out and do something that's incredibly meaningful, something where Atlantic will be known. At that point in time, in many countries in the world, we were seeing the opposite of ethical leadership. And all of a sudden, Chris started bringing out these notions about leadership, thinking about, so roads came on the agenda. We had Bridgespan doing work for us on leadership programs. So all of a sudden, it was the Big Bang, it was ethical leadership, but it was also pulling together the history of Atlantic. So we weren't going to go into new geographies, we weren't going to do new themes. We were actually going to integrate what we'd done and magnify it, really, really give it oomph. So we would choose a limited number of subjects where we would partner with the most credible people in the world. I can remember the first conversation when we started talking about Trinity College Dublin and University College San Francisco on the healthy aging mind. And I was mesmerized. I was thinking that people like that would come and collaborate with us and partnership with us. And I'm only choosing one example because I don't have a lot of time. But we were able to repeat that 7 times. Aboriginal rights in Australia and having the team from Melbourne University coming. So all of a sudden, this notion of ethical leadership started to rebound, but across a number of limited fields, because obviously we had to limit them because the money we had. And we started to think about what a big bet actually meant. What was a long-term bet? Now this brought in complexity. So when you're thinking about a grant that might run for 20 years, then all of a sudden the questioning that you're doing of the host institutions takes a different frame. If it's one project and it's going to last a year, you can get your mind around that very, very quickly. This wasn't dating. This was marriage. This was generational change. So the intensity of the due diligence, the intensity of the processes that we put candidates through, in hindsight, probably was unfair. But at the time, I felt it was essential to do that so that we would be pairing with people that were there for the long term and had responsibility. I think institutional inertia was the dread that I had in this process. When you deal with universities or big companies, they can be very, very slow to do things, and when they do, they can make radical changes. And I was continually concerned about when they made these changes, whether our interests would be heard. So the process of evaluation was different. But the board was small. The board was committed. It was a committed, involved, capable, competent group of people that were there with you the whole time. The era pre this small board, it wasn't like that. It was sort of like a level of detachment. It was slightly academic. So for me, the big difference was the way the board worked, the notion of the Big Bang, the notion of ethical leadership, the notion of holistic programs. 2 sentences and I'll finish. But the punchline, when it really struck me and how brilliant it was, when I started to think, and others, so don't get the impression it was me, when we started to think, imagine all of those programs being capable of working together. So it just wouldn't be one that was creating this ethical leadership and giving it a big push. But imagine the 7, that was the sort of notion we had at that time, could get together. And they might be housed in a single location in the sense of their development. Roads raised issues, which we might come back to later in the session. But all of a sudden, we've got 7 programs aligned, housed in the Atlantic Institute with the notion of Big Bang, ethical leadership, creating a forum where very, very talented, committed people were there knowing that they can and should make a difference. For me, it was the most exciting by a mile compared with anything I'd ever done before, and I've done a lot of flaky things. That's me, Mary.
Okay, thank you, Peter. You mentioned these other institutions. Obviously, you didn't do this alone. You had partners. You found partner institutions. Sarah, let's look a little bit about kind of the implementation, how you went about reaching this dream. A number of these local programs were put inside large, bureaucratic, hierarchical academic institutions. Yet the programs embrace a culture of equity, fairness, flexibility, things that universities are not well known for. Can you talk a bit about how and why the universities became the default institutional homes for these fellows programs? What the benefits were that you were hoping for, and perhaps what some of the challenges you thought might emerge?
Well, I think that universities seemed like a natural site, a natural nest for hosting the Atlantic Fellows programs because, first of all, of their stability. They were ongoing, continuous institutions with a great tradition. They had been there for a long time. Secondly, because they were resource-filled. They had lots of resources which we could use and which we could align with. Thirdly, because of the shared commitment. They were, like the Fellows programs, committed to the enterprise of teaching and learning. They were different in the sense that there was a commitment within universities to the focus on credentialing as one of the primary objectives, which I don't think was true of the Fellows programs. They also offered something which was sometimes elusive but important, and that is they offered a status in the wider ecology of education, that universities were places which had status. And they also offered us convening space, places to come together, to talk, to negotiate, places for discourse and exchange and critique. For some of us like me, who has spent the last 50 years of my professional life at a university, at Harvard University, universities were bureaucracies that felt familiar, that we understood, and we knew how to navigate them. We knew where to go to get things we wanted to get. So for all of these reasons, they seemed like an important alliance, institutional alliance, a good nest for hosting our programs. But there were also reasons why universities might prove to be inhospitable to our Atlantic Fellows programs. As one person put it, how do you successfully nest a nonprofit into the ecology of a highly bureaucratic university, as you said before? So the Fellows programs were intentionally iterative, improvisational. They were meant to be nimble organizations that could adapt and change more quickly than these stodgy universities. They were also different in that they were activist in orientation. Most universities are not activist in orientation. They're about thinking, theorizing about theorizing, but not so much about bringing that theory into practice, and having an impact. And very much from the very beginning, the Fellows program was activist. And our programs, the Fellows programs, were explicitly non-hierarchical, not bureaucratic or hierarchical, and we were engaged explicitly and purposefully in collective action. Another difference was that Fellows programs faced outward into the communities, rather than universities where there was an inward focus and a distance between what my kids called the wide world and what was going on in the academy. The Fellows program actually existed there to serve the community, to be responsive to the culture surrounding it, to the norms and the priorities of the communities that surrounded them. So this was a very, very different orientation outward. And although our programs were about learning and leadership, the program's focus was of a different kind of learning, not merely cognitive learning, not merely academic discourse, but also a kind of humanistic, humane learning that emphasizes, as we've said before, curiosity, empathy, fairness, inclusivity, kindness, and I even heard the word grace spoken earlier. in this conference. With my board colleagues, I often refer to the fellows programs as human development programs because from my point of view, it was really learning about people's full capacity as human beings. And the learning, I think, also within the fellows program that made it different from universities was that they are deeply political in the sense that fellows are learning about power, its uses, its misuses, its abuses, and explicitly addressing and supporting those folks who are powerless, who are on the margins. So that was another difference, that universities are not, they're certainly sitting on power, they embody power, but they don't see themselves as political actors in the community. So there were these very different characteristics, structures, purposes, agendas. Great contrast between universities on the one side and fellows programs on another. So it's not surprising that even though they at first appear to be good nests for our universities, appear to be good nests for our Atlantic Fellows programs, that that the nesting of the nonprofit within the bureaucracy requires accommodations, requires compromises, requires mutual learning on both sides. And it wouldn't be surprising at all that there would be tensions, that there would be frictions, some resolvable and some unresolvable. It's my view that it isn't that we want universities and our fellows programs to be absolutely aligned or even harmonious in their purpose, in their agendas, in their structures, in their characteristics. As a matter of fact, the contrast, I think, are very, very important until they get in the way of purposeful, productive action on either side. So I think, and I think one other thing I would say is that I think that the identity of the fellows programs is partly defined by the contrast with the university. That it is different, that it has a different purpose, makes it all the more clear what it is that the fellows programs are doing and what they choose to do and what the dream, again, is about in the collective action. Mm-hmm. So I think I'll stop there, Mary.
Okay, thank you. And we will come back to some of the issues that you've raised. But let's talk about the other piece of this programmatic structure, the community. So Chris, one of the things that I would often ask you as we were thinking about these programs was, would you be happy, would you and the board and Atlantic and Chuck be happy if you ended up with 7 wonderful programs in 7 parts of the world that were thriving and producing fellows that were having impact? And if the community thing just didn't work out? And you always said no. The global community was a critical piece of this. It wasn't just about 7 programs in 7 places. So what do you think? Why was this idea of a global community a kind of driving piece of the dream?
Well, let me say that it's an experiment, and it's a hypothesis, and it's one that has been inspired and informed by many of the people with us today. We've adopted and recognized the concept of Ubuntu, that we are who we are because of others, and these programs and this community evolved because of our discussions with people in this room and elsewhere. And in those discussions, there was an increasing recognition of some commonality, of themes that cut across cultures and places and professions. We heard yesterday from Manuel Pastor about the importance of intersectionality in establishing lasting and effective movements. So the notion of cross-program connectivity, awareness, interaction, was increasingly evident as something that was a distinct value that could be made to these communities which shared common values, orientations, and aspirations. We saw it on stage here with the fellows a couple of days ago when we saw 4 Asian fellows from the Philippines, from Thailand, from Malaysia and Indonesia. Each of them identifying issues in their respective environments about political fragmentation and the problems of governance, polarization, access to health care, issues of immigration and what that does to communities. These are universal challenges that we face. I often use James Joyce's, the famous Irish writer's phrase of in the specific, the universal. And so bringing fellows into a space where they see with specificity what is happening in a particular environment and culture and can recognize their challenges in somebody else's space, if nothing else, produces an appreciation of solidarity and opportunity that extends beyond our immediate environments. And the footprint for this was clearly Chuck Feeney's peripatetic lifestyle of moving around the world. And one of our board members used to be concerned about global creep, that wherever Chuck would show up, there'd be another program and another initiative. And as Peter pointed out, and we put some boundaries around that. And as we were going out of business, recognized that we would work with the people and the institutions and the places and the themes that we knew, and relied on the people that we knew who were experts in these spaces, and worked with them to develop these formats. As Peter pointed out, it was towards the end of this process, as we developed individual programs, that we realized that we wanted to have some kind of structure that would, some kind of platform that would provide the opportunity to bring these programs together and to bring the fellows together after they had completed their respective programs. That too is still a work in progress. And one of the reasons we're gathered here with the fellows and with this group here is to revisit what our hypothesis was in that regard and to identify ways in which the platforms that we've created can in fact support the community in ways that we hope. And I have to say, my mind after the last few days of exchange is just swimming with ideas and opportunities. So ask me this question again in a year or two. I am presently a little bit overwhelmed with the possibilities, but I think many of you here have seen those, and you know those, and most of the people in this room work across boundaries, cultures, and themes, and I think you can appreciate where those opportunities lie. But this is a call for your input into ways that we can make that more effective.
Thank you. Over the last few days, we have seen the programs present, the fellows present, and yesterday the executive directors or board members present. And one of the common features has been a kind of focus on values of different kinds, of, I think, what Peter has called ethical leadership, and Sarah, humane learning and action. So there does seem to be this common thread across the programs that is around questions of values. And I'd be interested, Sarah, in unpacking that a little bit and thinking about, as you were working to develop these programs, what was it that you thought Atlantic would distinguish Atlantic Fellows from other leadership programs, other thematic master's programs on various forms of inequality? what was going to be different here?
Well, you know, it's interesting because you mentioned earlier that I was a MacArthur Fellow and had this sort of notion of, of fellowships as being something like those. And this seems very, very different. The MacArthur Fellowships are very, very individual, and they are about individual creation and creativity and expression. And this seems to me at its very core a collective endeavor. That is, we've talked about, or I've talked about, a humanistic, humane learning that underscores empathy, curiosity, fairness, equality, dignity for all. And these values are not only made explicit in the programs, but we are, hopefully, they are enacted and embodied in the people in the program. So they are not only individually held and expressed, but they are amplified, as Chris was saying earlier. We hope at least that was a hypothesis, amplified by the collective. I think it's also true that these were values that are shaped by the cultural context. They were these universal themes across all the programs, but we knew that they would be expressed very differently in different cultural contexts. In other words, we interpret these central values in different ways, given the cultural variations among us, and that so that the universal was there, but we were also interested in variation and diversity in the ways this was expressed and embodied in the programs. I think, too, that at least what I considered very, very important and loved was that the values were also deeply embedded in the stories we tell about ourselves and our origins and our communities. One story leads to another story as people weave the webs of human connection. So through storytelling, through the developing a narrative, both our individual narratives and our collective narrative, our institutional narratives, we are engaged in building this human connection. I think Chris talked about James Joyce. I always think about Eudora Welty, who's my favorite storyteller, who always says, I begin with the particular, never the general. And that's another way of her expressing this notion that in the particular resides the universal. And stories, it seemed to me, express that very, very, very beautifully. And I think the other thing, as I've looked at the vignettes from earlier days in our gathering over the Zoom, values are expressed as well, at least in this collective, in art form, in art. The music, the poetry, the dance, all of the senses, all of the senses, all of the art forms. As I looked at the videos of the vignettes from the first 3 days, I could feel the ways in which the collective was coming together through this expression of art, and art in so many different forms and cultural contexts. The ways that people were making deeply soulful connections, I felt, at least, as they practiced and enacted the values embedded in these programs. I don't know of any other fellowship program that behaves in this way, where there are gatherings in this way that I've at least tried to describe here.
I think it's interesting, perhaps, to continue the conversation about what is collective, what is common, what is general, what is specific, and how to ensure that both the general and the specific reside together as we move forward. I think your focus on the ethical and on values leads back perhaps to something that Peter raised in his early remarks. He said, we might come back to roads. And, you know, yesterday, Chris, you when you opened this convening. You said some of the people here you've known for 20 years, some you've known for 10 years. Most of the institutions that you decided to partner with, that you approached, that you thought about as potential partners, perhaps in the end were not partners. Most of these had been long-term Atlantic grantees. They had people in them whom you had worked with and who you knew, often who Chuck had known. But for Rhodes Trust, this was not the case. This had not been a long-term grantee. And there was at the same moment the controversies that Tracy mentioned, Rhodes must fall, and lots of things in the air that might have led you in a different direction. But you decided to host the Atlantic Institute, something that would try to achieve collective change at the Rhodes Trust. Can you talk a little bit about that thinking process that you went through in doing that?
We, as Peter said, as we began to explore how we could support the community of programs and what form that would take, and Peter and I share an operational perspective on what does that structure look like, how do you sustain it. Atlantic was committed and had plans to spend its money and disappear. That meant there had to be a platform that continued beyond the life of Atlantic. We spent a lot of time reflecting on what that should look like, including inventing and starting up our own Atlantic Institute organization in a standalone space. We considered looking, as we did with the programs, at other universities generally, and maybe finding an administrative home for that. I had worked with Sir John Hood, who was at the time chairing the Rhodes Trust when he was at Vice Chancellor, University of Auckland, and he'd worked in the health area in Asia. And I went to him as part of our listening sessions about fellowships and experience in scholarships and fellowships, among many other organizations. And I was taken by what was happening within the Rhodes Trust and its orientation to continue to advance its scholar community based on values. It's always been a publicly spirited, publicly oriented effort to build scholars who would contribute not just in academic and technical ways, but in ways that were rooted in values, publicly oriented values. And there was also a movement afoot within the Trust to think about how to harness the community of scholars, that this wasn't just a one-off, DPhil degree program at a prestigious university. It was, what do you do with these 5,000 Rhodes scholars who have tremendous experience and skills and a publicly oriented motivation to make a difference in the world. 19th century language, fight the world's fight, but the concept was the same, this notion of how do we contribute to changing systems and historical systems. There's a lot of, cloudy legacy with Cecil Rhodes the man, and this exploded in the middle of our discussions. The Rhodes must fall. This is the world we live in. These are the challenges our fellows need to navigate. We felt these were spaces where there would be contestation, where there would be discomfort, where there would be deep challenges to our established way of thinking. And we saw that as a plus. Sarah mentioned sort of being at a prestigious location. Status is defined in different cultures in different ways, and we were not seeking necessarily to impose a northern version of status, but a university that's been a center of learning for 900 years brings something to the table. There is a lot of international ferment in that space, and even those fellows who were uncomfortable with walking into halls and Max Price can speak to this probably better than I. That discomfort is part of the challenges that the fellows who are going to be influential and impactful need to understand, navigate, participate in. There's also a process of demystification. Somebody in this room, I won't mention, was at a recent executive program at a very prestigious university and walks away thinking, gosh, I knew a lot of that stuff already. So there is this process of being in halls of traditional power and even elite character that demystify and reorient someone to the work that they do without a sense of being second best or left out of some kind of elite vision of what the world can be. But more than that, we saw people oriented to similar values, investing in other people with a view to building communities that would address some of the great challenges of our time. And in an environment that was very international, that had over a century of experience in investing in young people. And it has been a really very positive and I think very successful partnership, and as I will say again, a continuing experiment.
Mm-hmm. And I think in a number of ways, this mirrors what's going on in the individual programs, where how to navigate diversity of perspective in respectful and constructive ways is really a part of each of the programs. And one of the things that I think, as I've spoken to fellows, that they take away is that sort of maturing of their capacity to engage with ideas and people that they might not encounter in the micro work that they've been doing before coming to the program. So that might be a sort of hallmark of what this community is about. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the floor. And I want to come back to the sort of bigger picture. We started with the dream. We went into some of the machinations that attempted to implement the dream. And Peter, you know, we're several years out now from the last board meeting and the final decisions to make these grants. You already said something about perhaps we were too hard on the programs. But given what you know now, is there something you would have done differently? Something as a board that you would have wished you understood better or knew more about in order to increase the likelihood of success of this whole enterprise? Not an easy question, sorry.
No, it's okay. I want to go backwards, perhaps, to start the answer. When I think about organizations, I think about passion, energy, focus, competence, and organization. And I've looked at thousands of companies. And this model, if you like, carries me through lots of different places. Probably for the last 15 years or so, I've been very, very conscious about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are only coming out now in today's words, and they weren't the words that I used. But what it was really about was establishing whether the leaders really did have a vision, whether they really could convert the vision into a plan, whether they could convert the plan into actions and to people. And that is what differentiates. You know, people say to me, this guy's a great visionary, but, you know, and then the joke becomes, but he couldn't run a fish and chip shop. All of those notions. So you're searching continually for this amalgam of characteristics, and it's very, very difficult to find them. So where I thought the challenge was difficult for the board was contemplating the notion that perhaps one of the programs wouldn't get to the level that we felt was sufficient to create liftoff. And therefore I felt it might be difficult for people that had never been through a process of saying, we'd rather not give you any more money and we'd rather you not go any further. So that was the part of the process that I often wondered about. But what was wonderful to watch was as soon as we got to the conversations that perhaps suggested that one of the programs might not really have the full package of ideas and ability to deliver that was necessary, everybody on the Atlantic board sort of got around the issue and didn't take the easy way out and say, let's scrap this one. It went into a form of overdrive. It went into, why can't we get people from one of the other programs to come and talk about this? Why can't we? Why can't we? Why can't we? So all of a sudden, the Atlantic, that I don't think had ever existed before, all of a sudden is in full flow, helping a program to meet the standards that we felt were necessary to give the money, which was based on a belief that for the next 20 years they would make it work. So that was for me the wonderful transition. Today, to use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion is fashionable. But I invest in lots of companies, and very, very few companies actually get their mind around that. You know, is it, you know, do we have female representation? Do we have people from different countries? Do we have people from different skills? We had a funny story in one of the programs where the program wanted to blend these skills together and to get a particular set of skills. I shouldn't talk about what they were, but they might have been a cartoonist. And this guy didn't have an undergraduate degree. And all of a sudden, the university is saying they didn't really want this person to take part. And for me, that was a fascinating exercise where the institution had values, and yet to make the program successful, we needed the combination of skills that might in some ways contradict the values of the university, and yet how quick the university were to see the benefits of the skills that this person could bring, even though perhaps he didn't have the necessary undergraduate qualification. So when I look back, Mary, I'm amazed that all of the initial choices came through. If you'd have asked me to bet at the beginning, what's the probability at looking at 5 startups and then coming to the conclusion that all of them have qualified, I'd have said to you at the beginning, I don't believe that. If we get to 3, I'll be happy. If I get to 4, I'll think it's wonderful. And the chance of 5 is just not there. And I think what this showed was, and I'm not going to talk about the strengths of the board, what it actually showed was the flexibility of the organizations. So when we were talking to Trinity or talking to UCSF or whichever ones we were talking to, they were getting these messages. They were understanding the need for adaptation in certain places. And that was fantastic. It wasn't what I expected. I expected institutional inertia, a lot of resistance, and we might be moving on to find another partner. If you'd have said to me at the beginning, would all of the programs have come through in the way that they've come through, and the first 2 or 3 years of their existence, would I have believed that they could have done this? My answer would be no. Your question was, what would we have done differently? This is a terrible question for me because my wife describes me as a perfectionist, so you should never ask Peter what we could do differently because he'll keep you up all night.
It's too late.
But the punchline in this question is the interaction, Mary, between the board and the staff and Bridgespan, and the individual programs and the programs collectively exceeded any expectation that I had. So I'm sitting here, I'm in the mountains in Colorado, and it's amazed me. I mean, it's just incredible to sit back now and look back and think of the hiccups which gave emotional tension. There were meetings, some of the Atlantic board meetings, where we didn't agree with each other. And that was often, and I think that's healthy. So Mary, I think I would honestly say I wouldn't mind letting someone write this up, and you can do it, and if any lessons come out of it, great. But I honestly can't think of anything I would have done differently. And I don't mean me as a person. I mean the Atlantic board, the Atlantic organizations, and the organizations that we worked with, both the implementing partners and the host. For me, it's been great. I don't say that often.
So one of the unspoken words that come to mind as you were talking is there was a pyramid at one point that you looked at and thought about. Well, the bottom layer is the organization. Does it have an organizational structure? The next layer is the program. Does it have a program that's actually doing something and people are applying to it and they're getting something out of it? And at the very top, it said trust. And in some ways, what you're talking about in your last statement, Peter, is that the iterative process of working together over a period of time and doing the hard questioning and the hard reading and the hard work resulted in, well, everything may not be perfect, but we trust that these are good people and that our ideas, that our goals are aligned, and therefore we can step back. And I think this question of trust is a really interesting one to think about. But I think it's time to open up to the floor. And do we have somebody who's going to provide microphones to people who raise their hands? You all had many questions from this board when you were working through this, and now it's your chance to have at them, so please.
Mary, thank you so very much. I want to thank you, and it's such a pleasure to hear Sarah, Peter, and of course Chris always, and to get the deeper background on the story. What you've done is to invest not in buildings that depreciate over time, but in people who appreciate over time. And you've done it in a way that, to my mind, creates the basis for a social movement through leadership around the world. My question to you is, if you were to come back in 10 years, what would you hope to see as the then ongoing product of this enterprise?
Yeah. Would you like to direct that to anyone
Sarah
in particular?
or Peter?
I'd love to hear each person's reflections if there's time.
Sarah, would you like to feel that?
I don't have any large a dream about this any larger than I have it now. I think it will continue to be, I hope, an experiment. It will continue to be one large collaborative, collective adventure. And it will change as the world changes, and it will be a part of that change. I don't even think about numbers so much, although I think these networks will get bigger and bigger, the community will get bigger, the gatherings will get bigger. But I think that it will still be propelled by, the energy will be propelled by individual and collective service and activism towards making a more just world. I don't feel the agenda changing at all. I do think that as when we think about the time now, when leadership is so obscene, so much of leadership is so obscene and ugly and demeaning and disrespectful and lacking in trust and worthiness, you realize that this has come at a moment, an extraordinary moment, as a really important response to that. But and I think that it will always be needed. But I think that there's something about the time, the moment, that brings out what's really rigorous and special and hopeful about this approach of the Fellows programs and of the institute that holds us all together.
Was that Bruce then, Mary, that asked the question?
That,
Was it?
Harvey Feinberg, who sits on the China Medical Board,
Right?
among many other things.
Right?
The two words that continually resonated through the evaluation process of the programs would be, how do you ensure permanence? And I would say, it's not an aspiration I have, and I'm not sure that there's anything in life that has permanence. You know, you can search for continuity of themes. You can't search for a permanence of a structure and just expect it to go through every iteration to solve every different societal issue. So we were looking for a value system that would offer continuity. I think the expressions that came up so often was this notion of the mover and the shaker. There's someone that would bring something, not necessarily as an individual, but as collectively within a program. So it's not, you know, Superman, but it's the holistic team. It's the development of programs. It's a continual adaptation. The nature of the problems are going to change. The nature of the solutions are going to change. And therefore, having that flexibility built into the programs, flexibility and adaptation, was, if you like, always the dream that I had. And that we would get people together with different perspectives, and they would resolve their different perspectives. And they might even decide to go forward on multiple fronts with different perspectives. So it was very much about adaptation. It was very much about having flexibility. It wasn't searching for permanence. The thought of permanence, which some institutions seem to value, you know, we've been doing this for 500 years, so what's wrong with doing it for another 50 years? Whereas the reality is, you know, that's not the way society works. It's not the way problems work. It's not the way science works. Science has lulls, and then it has speed ups. And then it sags, and then it goes through iterations where they bring other disciplines in to give them a kick, to get them moving in the right direction again. What I believe in is holistic solutions in multi-skilled teams. I believe fundamentally in the diversity, equity, and inclusion that allows you to create teams with multiple disciplines and make sure that how those groups are organized create the appropriate foci. That we actually do challenge what the world's major issues are and don't always sort of pick on the easy ones. That's what I've always dreamt about with the Atlantic Institute. And Chris has said it many times, fight the big fight. Go for meaningful wins. Go for moves in society that help society go in directions where the vulnerable and the disadvantaged get a fair break. And if we did that, and I know Chuck Feeney would be delighted, and he'd go to the next world feeling a very, very happy camper.
I'd like to respond to that very quickly, Harvey. In 2032, I would like to have 5,000 examples of what you saw on the screen with Jonathan Kofino and Sylvia Kuchin, really catalyzing a very specific response to a real need that has systemic and lasting impact. Impact on hospital sharing information systems, something that expands beyond an immediate goal but has a lasting systemic effect. That's one of my great aspirations, and I think we're going to work really hard. We'll talk about this at the Atlantic Institute Governing Board meeting, at capturing some of those stories, because it goes to the second aspiration, which is the narrative, the metaphor. This is what Sarah's been talking about, and we've been talking about here. We are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, and the stories of what the fellows will do, their values, their impact on modeling approaches and leadership styles, I hope will become, I'm trying to think of a word other than mainstream, but something that really pervades our societies and gives us a different vision of who we are and how we operate, including who our leaders are and the values they reflect. We've lost that in recent times, and I hope this community is going to be part of rebuilding and redesigning what that vision and style of leadership is like.
And Harvey, you mentioned the word movement. And last night at dinner, I was talking with Brian, and he said the word visibility, and the ways in which the community and the actions of the community need to become more visible exponentially in order to have the kind of movement that you're talking about. And tomorrow, we're actually going to be exploring the future in a session, and if Peter and Sarah want to listen in on that session, we can think more about this. Is there another question? Please.
Thank you.
Could you keep your hand up so a mic can come your way?
Thank you all for sharing today and for the important role that you played in making all of this possible. I was curious, with several of the programs being situated within predominantly white institutions, could you elaborate on the vision for how the programs might play a role in creating institutional change and cultural change within those institutions, and perhaps academia more broadly?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. We worked with institutions who themselves brought forward the desire to increase their diversity and their breadth of appreciation for some of the societal challenges. We were pushing on open doors. But we became partners with change agents within host institutions who were seeking to validate and advance those values and perspectives. If I may say so, after starting a program at the University of California in San Francisco on equity and brain health, the university adopted equity as one of its 3 pillars for all its work. Mm-hmm. I would be reticent to characterize those institutions as white institutions. They may have a legacy of being rooted in spaces and power structures that have been historically dominated by Northern European legacies. But I think there is a hunger, an interest, a desire to change that. And part of our parking some of these programs in these institutions was the openness and interest of these institutions to become more diverse themselves. And I know Peter said it's kind of become a flavor of the day, and you're looking for authentic interest and motivation and a self-interest in realizing those kinds of communities. But it wasn't exclusively that. We have programs that are rooted in programs in spaces that are not historically white. And I think you've heard from Tracy Naledi yesterday and a little bit of the history of Takano, our partnership in the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the presence in Bangkok from the China Medical Board of the Equity Initiative, which is rooted and hosted in very strongly in Asian traditions and peoples. And in University of Melbourne, we have Indigenous-led initiative, as you have heard from Liz McKinley. So the orientation is to enhance and expand those kinds of communities within the host institutions and work in partnership with them in ways that are aligned to transform them.
Peter or Sarah want to add anything?
I was going to say something very similar, Mary, to what Chris was talking about. If you take Takano, that's in South Africa. If you take racial equity, it's in New York, but it's focused on issues of color. If you talk about Fong's program, it's in Thailand. Did I say Melbourne and Aboriginal rights? So I've not, perhaps if you took all of the programs and said, if you like, on average, would it be slightly more towards the white part of the world? Then, you know, statistically that might be true. But I've never thought about the balance of the program as being predominantly white. In fact, for me, it's been probably slightly more in the other direction, as I've learned far, far more about the world than I ever knew when we started this exercise.
I think one of the things that's important is finding people within the university, finding them who are very much allied with what it is that our programs are about, and creating those relationships so that they are our partners in making change within the university. And I think that that relationship building, as always, is incredibly important and builds the trust that we talked about before. But I do think that that Chris was right, in a lot of these situations, we were banging on doors that were already open, and they welcomed us as people who might help them bring a more diverse, more inclusive community to the university.
Is there one more question? I think someone here had their hand up at the same time as the last person. Oh, there's several.
Nope.
You have the microphone.
First, thank you a lot for your reflection. I think in a certain way you were at the beginning like the fellows. You have a vision, you have a very nice idea, but and to train different leadership, to change people. The question is, how do you think you were able to go from a vision to have success, to implement the idea? Because it was not evident to be able to have success, to train, that the program that you are creating that is different from previous program become a reality.
So I think the question is, given that you were trying to do something different, how did you take that leap of faith to imagine that you were going to be successful? Is that right?
How did you go from the idea to the implementation?
How to go from idea to implementation?
Yes, so how do you have a success in to implement plan?
We're still working on the implementation.
Yes.
It is an ongoing process, and it's being driven and developed by people in this room, by the fellows themselves, by the institutions that host them, with leadership within each program that pulls these strands together. And it's taking different forms in different programs. And I think there are different challenges in different programs. So I don't think there is a maybe a rule that fits all with respect to how you go from concept to execution and success. I think an aspiration, maybe back to Harvey's question, is that we increasingly hope that the fellows will be the drivers of implementation and the ability to identify opportunities in which they're successful. And that these programs will hold the fellows, and the Institute will contribute to that across programs, so that they become the vehicles for realizing success. And so that's the aspiration, which is not to say that the teams in this room who support the fellows aren't in fact themselves critical catalysts for change. And in fact they are, and that's why they are holding these fellows and the programs.
But as a board, Chris, we had to let go, right? We had to decide at a certain point after saying, we trust that you can move forward on your own, and the fellows and the groups that support them. We had to be prepared to exit. One of the things that my colleagues know is that I wrote a book at the same time as we were going through all of this called Exit, the Endings That Set Us Free, and how important it is to figure out a way to exit and how important it is to figure out a time to do that and a way to ritualize that and give it some ceremony and pass the baton on with the trust that the people will continue to do the important work, but that it won't be the same as we imagined. That it will be different, and it will be their responsibility to move it forward.
I think the question that was asked is the great universal question. Converting an idea into action, converting action into something that's effective, that makes a difference. That's progress. Every project I've ever worked on, and whatever field it's been in, and I've had a number of different careers, that's always the challenge. Whether you're reviewing someone that's going to build a bridge, or whether they're going to create a school, or whether they're going to open another university, the ability to have the vision and then convert the vision into action and success. So it's a great, great question. And when you know the answer, please send me an email.
The one thing we do know, it's not a linear process, so.
That's true. It wiggles about.
Exactly. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this session to a conclusion. Of course, Chris will be here throughout the rest of the convening, and we're happy to pass questions along to Sarah and Peter. I'd like to end by just thanking everyone, thanking our panelists. You know, we're here to celebrate where you've come from. We're here to, in a sense, pass the baton, as Sarah says. The board got the ball rolling, but this is an iterative process, continuous. So the word adaptation, flexibility has come up. It's really now in your hands, the current community of leaders, which is obviously evolving. Some people have been here since the beginning. Some people have been a part of the program for 3 or 4 weeks. So this is now. The job is not finished and won't be finished as long as the programs exist. But the next phase is in your hands. Thank you very much for being here. for caring, and for taking this forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.